a very prime place on his calendar. For those of you who are new to the Wilson Center, he asked me to give you just a bit of background about the center. We were established in 1968 by the Congress. They had been thinking of different ways of honoring Woodrow Wilson, but in the end decided against another statue or another monument on the Mall. And instead they focused on a living memorial to Woodrow Wilson. As you may know, Wilson was the only president to have earned a PhD. And in his era, he was in fact quite a prominent academic, a well-known political scientist. In fact, his congressional government is a text that is still used in political science classes today. Wilson often commented that because he'd had an academic background, it made him more effective at parsing policy as a politician and a public servant. And he also thought that had he had more of an exposure to the real world of politics, it would certainly have enriched his research. And those two sides of Woodrow Wilson's life are what the Congress asked us to capture here at the center. We try to bring the best thinkers together with individuals who are on the front lines of actually making policy. We are not an institution that advocates a particular position. We see, as you will see today, our responsibility is really to try to clarify the choices that face the politicians and policymakers here around the country, and in many cases, certainly as today's forum, for instance, in many cases, policymakers around the world. It is my added pleasure to introduce today's welcomer, official greeter, and scene setter for the conference, Professor Robert L. Thompson. Appropriately enough, he holds the Gardner Chair in Agricultural Policy, one of those rare instances in which the name and the function seem to come effortlessly together. In many ways, Professor Thompson is something of a Wilson-like figure himself. In addition to having an outstanding academic background, he has been really in and out of key institutions, not-for-profit institutions. He's been a major advisor to the Trade Policy Group in the United States Trade Representative Office. He has served at the World Bank. He has deep international experience, really covering an amazing array of countries. For instance, Denmark, Laos, and Brazil. You can't think of a more challenging mix of countries. He has won we could be here all morning were I to go through the awards and honors that he has received. And I would just like to add one special note that, as you may know, Lee Hamilton, our president, represented the 9th District of Indiana for many, many years. And he always takes particular pleasure in having people with Indiana roots. And for many years, Professor Thompson taught and then was dean of the agricultural economics at Purdue University. So were I Lee Hamilton, I would be talking about how nice it is to have someone who is, at the very least, an honorary Hoosier here. Let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kent. Thank you very much, Kent, for that kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor and privilege to welcome all of you this morning to this International Conference on Cotton, the Next Steps for Africa. I'd like to extend a particular welcome to all the ministers and ambassadors from Africa, many of whom have traveled long distances to be with us here today, and who will add special importance to this event. But first, I want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for their hospitality in hosting this event today, particularly their Africa program, as well as their program on science, technology, and global affairs. The other sponsors of today's event are the Ideas Center of Geneva, Switzerland, which is an independent, not-for-profit organization dedicated to helping low-income countries integrate into the world trading system, and which has been active in particular on helping the West African countries to launch the C4 initiative. The other sponsor and organizer of today's event is the International Food and Agricultural Trade Policy Council, a group of which I had the privilege of chairing for 5.5 years, ending this past spring. The IPC is a group of about 35 independent individuals from 24 countries in all parts of the world, which meets twice a year and attempts to find politically feasible ways to nudge the trade negotiations forward. In its work over the past 5 years, the IPC has taken a particular interest in the problems of developing countries within the global trading system, and had a significant international development initiative leading up to the Doha round of trade negotiations. I also want to thank the Hewlett Foundation for their sponsorship of this event, as well as the International Cotton Advisory Committee for its contributions as well. We have a truly unique opportunity here today. Assembled in this group is a group of people with all perspectives in the international trade in cotton issues. When we were planning this conference, our initial idea was to focus on non-trade issues, because at that time we assumed that we would at least have the modalities agreed to by the time this conference was held, and that with them settled, we'd be able to focus on the non-trade issues that surround the trade or the cotton concerns of today. However, since we have not resolved the trade issues, they will also be addressed in today's conference. But the conference will also focus on the equally important issues of how to improve competitiveness and also the appropriate role of donors, whether they be public sector or private sector or not-for-profit sector donors. In agreeing to a sectoral cotton initiative, the WTO launched out in new territory, unprecedented territory, and in this sense I think WTO has provided some outstanding leadership in bringing about this two-pronged approach of focusing on both trade and development, which in a way paved the way for the Aid for Trade debate that came to particular focus in Hong Kong a couple of years ago. We are very much aware that progress on cotton will be difficult without further progress in the Doha round, and would therefore like to stress the importance of resuming and completing those negotiations, because cotton has become symbolic of the development focus of the round, and it is crucial to deliver on this issue. It is timely that this round of trade negotiations, known as the Doha Development Agenda, focus on the problems of developing countries, which now comprise the majority of members of the WTO. But it's also important because we have to move forward on reaching an environment of greater equity in the world. With 1.25 billion people living on less than $1 per day, 53% of the world's 6.5 billion people living on less than $2 a day, but with the highest concentrations of very low-income people being in sub-Saharan Africa as well as South Asia. But we're focusing here particularly on the problems of sub-Saharan Africa today, its challenges in addressing the poverty problem, and in the back of our mind we have to keep focus that 70% of the people living on less than $1 per day live in rural areas, and most of them are farmers. So the problems of trade and agriculture development and poverty reduction are inextricably intertwined as we address the issues of sub-Saharan Africa. These issues are complex. There are no easy solutions. If there were, we'd have already passed that point and be moving forward in solving the problem. The objective of the conference today is to address the complexity in a balanced fashion. We hope that the conference, because it is not an official government meeting, nor is it a WTO negotiating session, we hope that it will provide for a free exchange of ideas and views and provide some impetus for moving the issue forward. When you look at your program, there will be a few minor changes which will be announced as we move through the day in each respective session. But moving right into the program, because we are a few minutes behind in starting, we're going to focus in the opening session on the importance of cotton in Africa. We're privileged to have Minister Maiga with us this morning. Minister Maiga is the Minister of Industry and Trade in Mali. Prior to his current position, he was the advisor to the Director General of the Telecommunications Society of Mali. Mr. Maiga also served as director of the National School for Stations and Communications in Mali, the National Coordinator for the Development and Implementation of Telecommunications and Broadcasting Programs in Mali, and head of the Engineering Department at the Telecommunications Society of Mali. He holds a PhD in Telecommunications from the Telecommunications Institute in Mali. Minister Maiga, please take the microphone.
Maybe when you start to share, if you could make that announcement about everybody being addressed.
Bonjour. Also, de faire votre connaissance.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you.
Mesdames et messieurs, je vous
Ladies and gentlemen,
joindre à mes deux
I would like to join my two predecessors
de la tenue de cette rencontre.
to congratulate you on organizing this meeting.
Le centre
I would like to thank
Woodrow Wilson,
the Woodrow Wilson Center,
le centre IDEAS, ICP,
Ideas Center,
qui ont eu d'organiser cette séance.
ICP, and all those that took a role in organizing this meeting.
En Afrique,
Cotton
beaucoup d'entre
in
vous le savent,
Africa, as a lot of you know,
pense, non seulement
hold a special importance on the economic but also social level.
c'est aussi une culture mobilisatrice
It is also a cultivation that
tant pour les autorités nationales,
mobilizes
les couches paysannes.
public authorities and
L'importance du coton
rural
peut être
populations.
appréciée à travers
The importance of
un
cotton
nombre d'indicateurs
can be seen through
représentatifs.
several indicators that I will now describe.
De l'Ouest et du centre.
West Africa and Central Africa
En Afrique de l'Ouest et du centre, dis-je, plus de 15 millions de personnes
has 15
dépendent
million
directement
people
de la culture du
who directly depend on cotton
Dans ces
cultivation.
pays, le coton est un produit stratégique
In those countries, cotton has become a strategic
largement
crop
à la production agricole,
that
à l'économie,
heavily contributes
au commerce,
to
à l'emploi,
income,
en
agriculture,
un mot, au développement.
job market, in other words,
Par
in
ailleurs,
development.
Le coton est
Besides,
avant tout
cotton is,
un produit
before
pour les petits producteurs.
anything, a crop for
Les effets
small
positifs du
farmers.
coton sur la
Positive
lutte contre la pauvreté et le
impacts
développement des zones
on
rurales
rural areas are no longer need to be demonstrated in Africa.
La récolte se fait à la main.
Cotton crop is done manually in those countries. This is why
Le rapport qualité-prix du coton africain lui confère un avantage
Cotton
comparatif naturel
in
qui explique
African countries is cost effective and is competitive naturally,
et les volumes produits pendant ces 20-30
as can show the volume of cotton
coton est considéré
cultivated in the
comme un
past 30
exemple
years.
de réussite du
Cotton
développement
is
agricole
considered as a success in Central Africa and West
à
Africa.
l'amélioration
It contributed to improving the situation of small farmers, improving the access to basic needs, to schooling,
l'amélioration de leurs conditions
improving their
Le coton
lifestyles.
contribue aussi à
In
l'amélioration
short,
du
cotton
secteur
also contributed
agricole dans
to
son ensemble, notamment
the
la
overall
promotion de
agricultural
l'innovation agricole,
sector.
les effets positifs sur la
It
production
has
céréalière,
positive impact on grain production also,
pastorale,
rural production, dairy production,
et dérivés.
and other
Des emplois sont
side
également créés dans la
productions.
filière cotonnière à travers le conditionnement, le transport,
conditioning, transportation, and also
puisque près de
shipping
98% dans certains pays
of cotton
exportés.
sometimes amounts to 98% of work labor. It has a very important role, in particular within UEMOA, inside of the Western countries community, but also in the Central African countries. This has allowed for regional synergies to be set up, in particular as far as the textile industry is concerned. Therefore, the situation that I just described is a virtuous circle within development, and it assumes a competitive cotton. This will be difficult to remain when the comparative advantage of cotton is suddenly annihilated by subsidies in other countries. In countries such as Benin, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Chad, which are at the base of the sectoral initiative within the WTO, cotton amounts to 60% to 70% to export incomes of agricultural products, 30 to 40% of export incomes in those countries. In some countries, 98% of exported cotton goes to Asia, Latin America, and the European Union. Therefore, African cotton exporters are directly affected by trade mechanism in the world. They need to be able to take advantage of the reduction in tariffs, free market, etc. However, they are also subjected to the restraints by those rules, in particular subsidies in developed countries. The low prices of cotton on international markets has had a direct impact on cotton farmers in Africa. National income have been significantly reduced. Small farmers' incomes has also dropped significantly. Overall, the transformation, the processing industries in those countries has been directly affected. Subsidies in developed countries have therefore contributed to the increase in production and supply of cotton in the world. This is not justified economically. However, through those subsidies, cotton has flooded the markets, global markets, not to mention synthetic fibers and the introduction of GMOs here and there, but also the breakthroughs in biotechnology. Thank you, and this was the preliminary introduction that I wanted to do in order to start our conversations in this room. I hope that after this meeting, we will not have the feeling that we were yet at another conference, but we will walk out of here with the feeling that we really debated, that we gathered new information, that we also understood better, but we were understood better by the other participants. You represent influential sectors, and we are very happy to be here. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister.
We have the stage setting for the day. Oh, please. L'autre groupe vient maintenant. Okay, now I'd like to invite the members of the trade panel to come forward, and we will move directly into the discussion of international trade.
to see you.
See you again. Mark, good morning.
See you. See you. Long time to see. That's very kind. Was that bad, huh?
Okay, we have 75 minutes roughly. About how long do each of you, what did she tell each of you?
10 to 15.
10 to 15, okay. Okay, as I said before, when we planned this conference, we hoped that the modalities would be resolved in the agriculture negotiations and that we'd be well into the stage of negotiating tariff schedules. Well, as everyone knows, the negotiations went into indefinite suspension this summer, and we are going to talk about trade issues today. But we're extremely fortunate in having as one of our panel members Crawford Falconer, who is the chairman of the agricultural negotiations. Crawford was a negotiator for New Zealand in the Uruguay round, and he has served as a panelist or chair in more than a dozen dispute settlement cases under the GATT and the WTO. So he came to this process of the negotiations extremely well qualified, and we really appreciate him traveling so far to participate in this meeting today. On this panel, we're going to talk specifically about the cotton and the cotton initiative. And he will be making a second presentation at noon in which he'll focus more specifically on the trade negotiation issues. But at this point, Crawford, welcome, and we're delighted to have you here.
Well, thanks, Bob. I suppose it's a professional weakness of everybody who works in Geneva that they are endemically repeating themselves. And I think it's particularly cruel of the Woodrow Wilson Centre and the IPC that they are going to inflict on you a practical explanation as to how the Geneva process is so ground down, because I'm going to have to speak to you twice. And I don't think there's much chance that I won't be able to repeat myself, at least in some respects. Frankly, given where we are in the negotiations, I think we need a little less repetition and a bit more innovation. And I don't want to spend too much time on the general framework of the negotiations on this cotton discussion, because I think there are very specific things on cotton that need to be talked about. Perish the thought, maybe even actually done, but I have to say a few things. Whatever you may think about the cotton issue, however deeply you may care, and you should care about the cotton issue, the reality is that nothing will happen on cotton in the framework of the negotiations unless the negotiations as a whole move. That's the first thing. It's very simple. It's very fundamental. It's actually always been there as part of the basis upon which cotton was going to be dealt with, that it is clearly to be folded into an overall outcome. Absolutely clear. So those of you who properly care very deeply about cotton, and you'll undoubtedly in this audience have differing perspectives on that, depending on where you plant your cotton, and depending on what things matter most to you. But it's always and only going to change if there is an overall round outcome. And that's, given where I sit in Geneva at the moment, not an edifying prospect. So the reason I make the first point is in order to underline, and this is not because I've got some kind of job commitment in this. God knows this is a job I'd really like to be shot of. Almost as much as the people who have to deal with me wish I was shot of it. But if you want and are worried about where we are on cotton, worry and care about the state of the round, because this is not going to move unless and until the round moves. And I am absolutely concerned that we should move the round forward. I think it's still possible to do it. But I don't think there's any point in sunnily believing that it will just happen. Because, well, rounds have always happened and nobody's ever going to let a round fail. Wrong. It could fail. And I think one has to be absolutely clear about that. And if one doesn't want it to fail, one will have to do something about it, because it isn't automatically going to happen. And cotton is inevitably part and parcel of that. And even if those of you that are here, some of you that are here, don't care an awful lot about the rest of what's going on in the negotiations, let alone what else is going on or should be going on in other parts of the negotiations, it may seem deeply unfair, it may seem tiresome, it may seem tedious, but cotton won't move unless the whole package moves. That's a fact. Now, second thing, politically very important for the negotiations, while that is what I've described as the case, there is a specificity to cotton within the negotiations. And there are reasons for that. It was politically agreed. And indeed, you could say that the Hong Kong meeting made it, if anything, even clearer that while the whole negotiation will be the basis upon which anything happens to reform cotton trade, it will have to be faster and further for cotton. Now, a lot of people don't like that, perhaps because some people would believe that they'd like to see the negotiations go so far that the concept of further becomes redundant, because everything will have gone so far that it's pretty infinitesimal to say that cotton would go much further. That's one view of how the negotiations should go. I think it's pretty much a minority view of how the negotiations should go. And there are other people who really don't think it's terribly fair that cotton should have been singled out that way. But I make no pretenses to understand anything very much of the other two official languages of the WTO, French and Spanish. My command of English is pretty poor. It's only my second language, having been brought up in New Zealand. But it's pretty plain to me, however you interpret the English language in Hong Kong, that there is an intention, a clear political intention, to move further and faster on cotton. Okay, I don't repeat the bureaucratic language, but that's the clear intent, and that will have to be delivered on as part of the package. And to some extent, it almost feels a bit academic to me to talk about that aspect of the framework, because given that we're so stuck more generally, the big priority for the negotiations is to get moving at all. But it is worth working on the assumption that we will get moving again, spending a moment or two talking about the specificity of the trade aspects of cotton. Now, you have on your panel, and I know in the audience, people who are far fitter than me to talk about the economics and the detail of the cotton industry. So I'm not going to pretend to do that. But I just want to make a few more general political points about this as far as they affect the negotiations. I myself, being a chair, have neither personality nor views nor anything interesting to say. These days I don't even know whether a chairman can acknowledge a fact without there being fear that it represents some kind of hidden agenda. I have no hidden agenda. I just want these negotiations to be over with as soon as possible. And I know, even if I take a purely mechanical approach to this, that will only happen if we have an overall outcome. And it will only happen if we deal with cotton in that context in a way that genuinely reflects the political undertakings that were made at the beginning of the negotiations and reaffirmed in Hong Kong. So what does that kind of tell you about what would have to happen if we're going to get somewhere. Well, we don't know yet. I almost blush because I'm chairing a process which is supposed to be clarifying it, but we don't know yet where we will end up overall on domestic support or trade supporting domestic support. We have proposals on the table. We have a position from the European Union which reflects their own domestic reform program, which includes how it affects cotton, which gives them quite considerable scope to make the principles of reductions in the negotiations on trade distorting domestic support, because in their own domestic reform program they have the capacity to go a long way down because they've made the domestic changes to their regimes that will enable them to, in the WTO speak that we have to live in Geneva, to bind that in the WTO. And so you could argue there that for them in cotton on trade distorting domestic support on cotton, they can go a long way down. Okay, talk about the numbers in detail if you want to, but they can go a long way down on that because that's something they have been able to do and are going to do domestically. They're committed to that. Because they've made reform domestically in their price structures and their support programs, they're also in a position to eliminate any export subsidies as well. So on the subsidy side of things, and it's really the subsidy side of things we're talking about post-Hong Kong. Not completely, but mostly. You have one major subsidizer who is in a position to deliver because of the fact they've taken domestic political reforms or committed to doing it. In the case of the United States, since the last Farm Bill, they are not in that position in the sense that they have not taken any unilateral decisions that would allow them to make the kinds of reductions in domestic support, including on cotton, that the EU is in the position to do from its originally high base. What the US has done is it's made a proposal to reduce its overall trade distorting domestic support and to reduce the most distorting domestic support. And that's been on the table since October. As in any negotiation, you go through this 3 phases when people do that. First of all, people say, that was very good, very bold, very courageous of you, we really welcome that proposal. And then they say, well, you know, you just need to do a few more tweakings to this proposal, and it could be pretty good. And then you move to the phase where people say, well, actually, you know, hey, this is a long way short of what we need. That's the logic of a negotiation. That's how it works. You know, it's not like anybody's being unkind or unfair, but you know, it's what happens in every part of the negotiation. And we're in that phase now. But because it's an overall proposal, it's not specific about cotton at all. And I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but basically, we don't know, even within the proposal to cut what's called the aggregate measure of support, quite significantly, what and how far that would go in relation to cotton specifically. We don't even know yet the base period that would be used for calculating that. US wants a base period for calculating product-specific AMS commitments, which is quite different from what the rest of the membership want. And if you use a different base period, you have a much higher base from which you cut. And suffice to say, at the moment, there's very significant difference between those two areas. But I'm not going to bore you with the detail anymore, just to illustrate that we won't be in a position to be clear about what could happen on cotton unless and until we know what the overall figures are, and then we'll work back to how that relates to cotton. That's the political reality. Might argue it should be otherwise, but it isn't going to be. So then I want to come back to what is the really important principle in all this for me, given where the situation is in the negotiations right now. For better or for worse, the reality is that this will be a total package. We will, at some point in the negotiations, and it's been there already, but it will have to be operational, figure out how we deliver on the political commitment to move further and faster on cotton. But politically speaking, that will only happen in a framework in which we have much greater clarity about what is going to happen right across the commodity frameworks of domestic support, of subsidies, and what will happen on market access, because this is a whole package. Now, if I was a New Zealander, which I no longer am, and indeed probably will never be allowed to return to the country again, and I'll be very glad probably not to, because I'll be tarred and feathered if we ever do get an outcome of this negotiation. And if we don't, well, I'll be looking forward to being tarred and feathered, because I'll have something worse in store for me. But if I was a New Zealander, I would be looking at these negotiations, among other things, but principally through the lens of dairy products. I'm sure if I was a Brazilian, I'd be looking at it through the lens of chicken and beef, soybeans. If I was an Argentinian, some of those through the lens of corn. So where you sit depends on what your commercial interests are. And all of these characters are going to have to get some degree of satisfaction. And part of the political package, I'm not saying it's something that's fair and reasonable. God knows nothing in international trade much is fair and reasonable. The only trick is to make it a little bit more fair and a little bit more reasonable and keep moving in the right direction. It will only happen if we can get satisfaction on both domestic support and market access, generally. And we're stuck on both of those because there are defensive interests everywhere in the negotiations. Now, that doesn't mean to say it can't work. It's a question of trying to balance those elements. And people are quite right to say, well, look, when it comes to cotton, it isn't fair that we should worry about trying to cut cotton subsidies and to argue that we're in a bit of difficulty doing so because somebody else can't get access for their chicken to the European Union or their pork to Canada, which I suppose is like selling coal to Newcastle or ice cream to Eskimos, but some people want to do it. And I suppose from that perspective it is unfair. But there are only two things I would say. One, keep saying it's unfair if you believe it, because that's part and parcel of the political equation. But also acknowledge that it's a reality that will have to be dealt with. And that's the responsibility that all negotiators take upon themselves, because there's a converse there. Not perhaps so much for this audience. But that is, well, okay, you might also only see things through a particular commercial lens. But bear in mind, on an issue like cotton, it works the other way as well. There is other responsibilities there in the negotiations which have been politically reflected in the mandate and need to be taken account of. And I think it's important that one, in that context, remembers the framework. Economists will argue about how big the price effects of various domestic support programs are. But I don't think anybody can seriously deny that domestic support programs, particularly and on cotton, diminish prices and returns to producers who are, in the case of cotton, appallingly poor. And I think it's a bit academic to argue whether it's 10% or 3% or 20%. I don't think there's any getting away from the reality that it contributes to poverty. So, it's one more reason, there are other reasons, one more reason why we need to make the round succeed, because if you care about that, and I think people should, and politically they have said undoubtedly that they will deal with it, then it needs to be part and parcel of an outcome. Probably won't happen otherwise, and that would be a pity. So I hope that those of you who are here and who care about this will think of it in the broader context and will join those who understand that we need to make this round succeed. It's one other reason why we need to make the round succeed. I've been to Benin. I've seen on the ground what the reality is. If I'd ever had any reason to want the round to succeed, I certainly would have got one when I went there.
Thank you very much, Crawford. We have an addition to this panel. Ambassadeur Bamanga, est-ce que vous êtes ici? Pouvez-vous venir à la table? We have we're supposed to have
This way?
Is he going to use the podium? Or just...
Okay, I'm very pleased to introduce Ambassador Bamanga, who is the permanent representative of Chad in Geneva. Ambassador Bamanga has a master's degree in international law. He's a career diplomat for the government of Chad, having served in Germany, Italy, and Saudi Arabia prior to his current assignment as the permanent representative of Chad in Geneva. He's also served as a counselor to the Prime Minister and as director of the Foreign Affairs Department in his government. Ambassador Bamanga, we're delighted to have you here today, and we look forward to your comments.
On sera très intéressé par vos remarques.
Comme vous voulez.
Par le respect pour le président,
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to, first of all, offer my apologies on behalf of our minister who was not able to come today to speak about the regional initiative on cotton. He did ask me to come speak in his place, and he's very sorry that he wasn't able to come. And so as to not disrupt the agenda too much, he had asked me to present in his place. So what we would like to first of all say is that now that we have this opportunity, we are fortunate enough to have such distinguished people here, such recognized experts in the field of cotton with us today, working with us in our common fight, our common struggle. The countries who have initiated this proposal for cotton, we feel that this is very useful to have this type of seminar today. And we would like to simply talk about what we call the cotton-based initiative, regional-based cotton initiative, rather. We're very pleased, as I said, to be able to have this opportunity to give you a few ideas about this initiative and to be able to have some dialogue and exchange on this very important product that provides a livelihood for millions and millions of people and which is a very central point of our economies. The first thing that I would like to say is that the very idea of creating this regional-based initiative, what we call Cotton 4, because of the 4 countries that originated it. This initiative was created, as you know, in the context of the WTO, and so given this, given the difficulties that African cotton growers were facing and the African economies were facing, we realized that this initiative was necessary, and this was Benin, Chad, and Mali, and Burkina Faso, where cotton is and remains a very major part of our economies, a very important part of our of our societies. In some of our countries, cotton represents more than 5 to 8% of our GDP and a majority of our export income. Cotton is produced by 33 countries, and somebody earlier mentioned the figure of 15 million cotton growers, and this shows you how many people actually live off this product. It is also something that is very highly linked to rural development, to health, education, and overall, in the general context, to the fight against poverty. However, the cotton industry in these 4 countries, Benin, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mali, has been seriously threatened in the past few years because of the massive subsidies that some developed countries, in particular the United States and other European countries, such as Greece, Spain, and Turkey, are giving to their cotton growers. So, to illustrate this point, during the period when this initiative was proposed, we saw that the United States had granted approximately 3.9 billion, almost 4 billion subsidies in 2001, which was for 40% of world cotton production. These are figures that allowed or that pushed our countries to initiate this proposal within the WTO. We are, of course, trying to also put the emphasis on the merits of having a more equitable international trade system, and we are trying to show that subsidies are making cotton prices decline on the world market, and this is causing serious difficulties for our African countries who are cotton producers and who export cotton, that have to then face extreme budget deficits in their national economies because of the drop in the cotton prices. So this, of course, leads to social problems in the rural communities in the cotton growing zones of the African countries. This situation, therefore, is what was behind our initiative to try to bring awareness to this issue. And being members of the WTO, we saw the need to bring to the forefront of this important institution the problems that we are facing in the cotton industry. That is why the 4 countries, as I mentioned, Benin, Chad, Mali, and Burkina Faso, submitted this initiative to the WTO, the regional-based cotton initiative, what we call the Cotton 4. So with references to the various different problems that are being faced in the cotton industry, we also try to propose sustainable solutions to the very significant problems that we are facing in the cotton industry. The problem with the 7 requests of these 4 countries is that these countries are not against the United States, and they're also not trying to fight against the European countries. What we simply want to see is a greater awareness of the fact that when countries are members of the WTO, they need to respect the rules of the WTO. Although the negotiations have been suspended for the time being, the countries, these 4 countries, have shown that we can come together around a single issue and work together to defend our common interests. So this is why our Cotton 4 initiative has been put on the table. We are asking for this sectoral-based initiative to be put into place so that we can help fight against poverty. We are also hoping to gain greater awareness and recognition for the strategic nature of the cotton industry in these African countries, and we are also asking for full support for our cotton export industry. And we are asking for measures to be applied by the United States and the European Union in particular. Solutions that will be negotiated within the WTO will hopefully result in a decrease in the subsidies granted by these countries, and also assistance and aid to help us support the African cotton industry and to remain a competitive industry on the world market. And also solutions that will help us be able to face the devastating effects of the drop in cotton prices. The requests made by these 4 countries have been made together. We have been working together, negotiating together, and we have been choosing diplomatic channels rather than bringing this to a legal battle. This is why we, as cotton-producing countries, we did not ask for special measures or for any exceptional measures. We are simply asking for the WTO's base rules to be respected, that is to say, fair trade, fair competition, and equitable trade. The cotton issue cannot be ignored in the Doha Development Agenda. A subcommittee was created to study cotton, and the chairman of this committee regularly meets with members of the WTO to discuss this issue. In 2004, after the Doha round in 2004 and after the Hong Kong Declaration, we saw that all WTO members need to be more engaged. We asked them to all be more engaged in this area and to help us support the sector-based cotton initiative. And we are still working to find a legitimate response to help the African people. And just to give you a little bit of history, sorry to back up, but to give you some important history, these four countries submitted proposals, I said, trying to find effective solutions by introducing fully operational concepts for new modalities that could be applied to the cotton industry. We began this debate within the negotiating rounds. The United States, however, held up the negotiations over the issue of cotton and said that it should not be negotiated as a side issue, but rather as part of the global negotiations. Despite all this, even though the negotiations were suspended, the four countries have continued to think about the issue and to contribute to the debate that is currently being held on both the bilateral and multilateral level in order to try to resume the negotiations within the WTO. So through these different issues, and cotton in particular, our four countries have been stressing the need to continue negotiating, and we have been proposing solutions. However, the solution that we are negotiating does not rule out the possibility of having legal recourse. We realize that one of the major issues, one of the major obstacles is the U.S. subsidies for their cotton growers. And we also dealt with this issue with Brazil in 2004, but we have not found a solution that has been agreed to by everyone. But this shows that because of the greater involvement by the African countries in this issue, we are seeing a greater awareness, and we are now in a more privileged position to continue our negotiations with Brazil and the United States. We fully understand all the mechanisms that are in place, and we have had a lot of experience. Our countries have had a lot of experience with working within the WTO context. And in the special group that was established, that at the request of Brazil to look at the measures that had been taken by the United States concerning prior decisions in dispute resolutions. So the representatives of these four countries are confident that the negotiations will resume and that we will be able to satisfactorily negotiate a solution that will be agreeable to all parties, and that everyone will uphold the principles of the Doha negotiations. Working along with our American and European partners, we hope to find multilateral solutions that will be politically feasible in our countries and in the partner countries to help us to remain competitive and to also help us to have a stronger presence on the international market in terms of cotton trade. Thank you very much, and forgive me for stepping back and giving you all this history. But I think that it was important to give you the context of the cotton-based, or the sector-based, cotton initiative. And I hope that this will help contribute to our discussions today. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Next on our panel, we have Pedro de Camargo. Pedro is the former Secretary of Production and Trade for the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture. During his time in office, he was responsible for the agricultural negotiations in the WTO, Free Trade of the Americas, Mercosur, and other bilaterals during the period 2000 to 2002, also during the period when the Brazil cotton case was launched. Pedro is currently the president of the Brazilian Association of Pork Producers and Exporters, and he's the past president of the Sociedade Rural Brasileira. He's been an IPC member since 1995, 11 years. Pedro, we're delighted to have you on the panel, and the microphone's yours.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, ministers, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor and a privilege to speak to such a distinguished audience. I wish to thank the organizers for this opportunity. Cotton has become a symbol of the inequities between developed and developing countries, a symbol of the strong distortions in international trade. The WTO Cotton Sectoral Initiative, led by Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, and Benin, gave political momentum to this cause. The Brazilian dispute with the U.S., where I was fortunate to work back in 2002, gave technical consistency, helping to expose the inequity. I wish to further our understanding of the issues relating to the future of the agricultural production, and I sincerely hope that my contribution will help us all enrich the crucial debate for the development of sustainable agricultural production here in the United States and worldwide. While I have been invited here today for my work in litigation at the World Trade Organization, let me start by saying that I have always valued negotiation over litigation. However, one should realize how difficult it has been for developing countries to achieve progress in many simple or theoretically simple issues. Litigation has hence been used as an instrument of change, as a communication tool for progress, as leverage for the essential transformations still needed. Sustainability of agriculture as well as of other sectors is a clear priority. Our capacity to grow and to develop new technologies exceeds our ability to manage development on a political level. Yet we are past the moment for change. Nature is giving us signals that we cannot ignore. Some decisions can no longer be postponed. The challenge we face today is to develop both public and private policies and practices under a democratic system and to incorporate the complex concerns of modern society into agricultural production system. As in any difficult task, we should start with the points of consensus. Let us in parallel debate and construct further consensus, but let us not waste time. We should immediately change what we know is wrong. And we all know that what is popularly called dumping is wrong. In today's global world, domestic policies have an international reach that we have not yet become accustomed to. Whatever a major country, such as the United States, does domestically influences the world very rapidly on an economical, social, and environmental scale. Goods have always been transported overseas, bringing change to societies. The crucial difference today is the speed at which the change generated by international trade occurs. Speed is also needed in the political decision-making. If we spend decades debating difficult political choices, technological advancement will simply overtake us. Half a century ago, countries understood the need for a rules-based international trading system and decided to negotiate agreements. Numerous rounds of negotiations eventually produced the WTO, under which agriculture at long last became at least partially covered by multilateral trade rules. It is true that agriculture has particular characteristics that require special attention. It is dependent on nature and has loose, if any, controls in volumes of production. Adjustments between supply and demand are more difficult and costly than any other sector. It is also a sector that has experienced enormous increases in productivity, immediately transferring the benefits of technological advancement to consumers. The flip side of this benefit to society is the enormous stress farmers permanently live under to maintain minimum productivity levels, which require heavy investments in human and capital resources. Agricultural trade rules should never have been left behind in international agreements in the first place. The only reason it took more than half a century to include agriculture in the multilateral trading system was that developed countries preferred to ignore the broader consequences of their domestic policies. They could afford to postpone the political difficulties that adjustments could bring at home. In the Uruguay round, developing countries lack the understanding, focus, and unity that would have been required to eliminate the most important distortion of trade, dumping. Allowing continued dumping in the Doha round would be a mistake that neither developed nor developing countries can allow. There is no need to compromise. We all know that dumping is incompatible with the principles of sustainability and that it should be eliminated as quickly as possible. This consensus has to produce results. We need to stop to exports below production costs and put an end to the deterioration of international prices through the support of rich countries' budgets and treasuries. We need to end this immoral competition in the international market, a competition which should be made illegal. Farmers should compete with farmers. Government support should not be admitted in the international market. We should not limit this ban to the classic definition of export subsidies in the Uruguay round. Indeed, we all know that subsidies under the so-called domestic support pillar of the current round of negotiations may assist exports through covering part of the production costs. The cotton case, the dispute Brazil had with the United States, made this perfectly clear. Why should developed countries' agricultural sectors, which already have much better production capacities, receive government support to compete with developing countries in the international market? Farmers in developing countries already face severe limitations such as weak public service, lack of public agricultural research, deficient extension services and public education, limited infrastructure, and a macroeconomic environment that rarely favors agricultural development. Competing against dumping as well is clearly unsustainable. We will hear later today about many of these issues, all very important. This specific panel is about trade, and I will limit my comments to trade. Eliminated agricultural dumping would not solve all distortions in the agricultural trade. It would, however, represent an important step forward, would create a new economic environment for agricultural markets and give new direction to the future development of domestic agricultural policies. Developed countries know that they have to change their agricultural policy. In the U.S. in particular, the debate about the new farm policy is intense. What started out decades ago as sound policy for production and the well-being of farmers has evolved into a series of distortions. Resources are being wasted. Some receive too much for nearly nothing, and the majority does not receive anything. The United States is not only competing unfairly with developing countries, it is also not preparing itself for sustainable production. It is not my place to say what should be done in the U.S. We in Brazil also have a lot to change in preparation to our country's future. But domestic policy, here and elsewhere, should not be allowed to export distortions caused by domestic political difficulties. An important first step would be to clear the international market of the effects of trade distorting subsidies. The cotton dispute initiated by Brazil is an attempt to address this problem. Litigation, however, will never replace negotiating. It cures in the absence of negotiation. The cotton craze reflects the wrong direction taken by the U.S. domestic agricultural policy in recent years. To this day, reactions to the cotton case in the U.S. remain very political. Even after the appellate body confirmed Brazil's crystal victory, this clearly illegal export subsidies Step 2 program has finally been eliminated. The rest of the dispute, at least reductions in marketing loan and countercyclical programs, is still completely undefined. The WTO dispute system will unfortunately again be called to produce results through Brazil's submission to an implementation panel that should start this week in Geneva. U.S. should already have made major changes. I can understand how the panel results can be ignored in Washington, weakening the credibility of the multilateral trading system. The world's largest economy and trader postpones in every way imaginable concurrence to the agreement on agriculture of the Uruguay round. Countries do not negotiate 8 years later not to follow what has been agreed and signed. Elimination or profound reductions in marketing loan and countercyclical payments should have already been occurred. These continue to be huge. Marketing loan payments were far larger in the past 2 years, 2004 and 2005, than they were in 2002 when the original panel made their decision. What is the U.S. waiting for? U.S. cotton production and exports have expanded significantly. Subsidized U.S. acreage has increased or stayed at very high levels. Prices have stayed stubbornly low. Brazil's share in African countries of world market exports has declined, while the U.S. has maintained the extremely high level around 40% of the international market. Marketing, loan, and counter-cyclical payments plus crop, insurance, and direct payments are still very high and continue to cause serious prejudice, the heart of the original WTO case. Step 2 illegal payments elimination has the effect of actually increasing counter-cyclical payments, absolutely not solving the issue by itself. The American taxpayer, U.S. Congress, and administration should get the message. The new implementation panel will produce results in parallel with the debate in Congress for the new Farm Bill. Let us hope this can be heard and understood by the American citizen. The cotton program should be changed, and not only because the U.S. lost a dispute and will lose others under agreed negotiated rules. The change should be unilateral. There is absolutely no sense in spending billions of dollars on a few fortunate and very organized producers for a program that has nothing to do with safety nets for farmers or with the sustainability of the global environment. The elimination of cotton, and indeed all agricultural dumping, should have become a U.S. proposal. This country has the obligation to lead the way in putting an end to what everyone agrees is wrong. The U.S. should not dump. Why then not lead the elimination of dumping on a global scale? But we cannot lose hope. Our participation, our creativity, and our goodwill in understanding each other's points of view are essential for the changes that will be necessary to achieve agreement on agricultural trade and that can lead the world to a sustainable production system. The export-oriented farm subsidy legislation of recent years is far from producing a sound U.S. policy. It is a race to the bottom of the international market that Brazil has faced with relative success. However, the economic pressures farmers confront only make sustainability more difficult for us and others worldwide. Eliminating dumping does not challenge the development of sound domestic policies. Safety nets for farmers should be developed. Environmental and consumer issues should be considered, but let us not export political difficulties abroad. This simple rule would be strongly supported by NGOs, urban society, academia, media, and others, and some rural segments of the developed countries, as well as, of course, by all developing countries that can afford to subsidize their own exporters. We can obtain a very considerable majority. Change is never easy, but we should be working in favor of better and sounder principles, trying not to limit the scope and creativity of domestic policy legislators. They could look at one major simple rule: no dumping. No exports with the help of subsidies, be they amber, blue, supposedly green, or de minimis. No export below production cost. No more disputes on this issue. The real challenge, the development of a worldwide, sustainable, modern agricultural production system, should unite us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Our next speaker will be Professor Daniel Sumner. Dan is the Frank H. Buck Jr. Professor of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of California at Davis. He also serves as Director of the Agricultural Issues Center at the University of California and as Chair of the International Agricultural Trade Research Consortium. Dan has had a distinguished academic career, having been recognized with most of the highest honors of the American Agricultural Economics Association, including Quality of Research Discovery, Quality of Communications, Distinguished Policy Contribution, and Fellow of the Association. But Dan has not only spent his career in academia, he's also spent time in government, and in the early 1990s served as the Assistant Secretary for Economics at the U.S. Department of Agriculture during the Uruguay round of negotiations. Dan has a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. Dan?
Now, I want to take this down so I can find mine.
Are you on the
Yeah, I'm
desktop?
right here.
Okay.
So I'm actually going to use some slides here. We've just heard some, I think, illuminating and passionate remarks about cotton in Africa, cotton policy in the United States. I'm going to take a step back and do maybe what was called academic earlier. I'm going to get into some of the numbers because I do think it's important for us to look at some of the numbers as we go along. So I'll spend a few minutes doing that. It may help some of the discussion. My focus is, and I think we heard the president of the Agriculture Committee of the WTO give the basic point. Everyone agrees that cotton subsidies depress world prices and therefore hurt some very poor people, very poor exporters of cotton. I think it's important to understand why and how much. That is what, and also to understand what is happening now to reduce or eliminate these adverse effects and what more can be done. And that's what this conference is about. There are three proceedings, so to speak, that are converging. Brazil won the WTO cotton dispute, but the U.S. is resisting implementation. Politically, that shouldn't be a surprise. Economically, it may be a surprise, but politically, it's not a surprise. The African Cotton Initiative that we've heard about this morning already is a part of the Doha deal that's on hold. I think there's things that can be done in the context of that initiative, and some of that happened yesterday even. And then, of course, the next U.S. Farm Bill may make some major subsidy changes, and that could be a vehicle for additional subsidy reductions in addition to what the WTO dispute implementation might do. Some people, and it's natural to ask, why cotton? Cotton's a tiny part of world trade. Why does it get such attention? And, of course, it's gotten lots of attention in the WTO. Frankly, a disproportionate amount of attention relative to the amount of trade. That's easy to say. Count headlines versus a dollar's worth of trade in cotton is a high agenda item. Within agriculture, I think it's fair to say that cotton has very high subsidies in the United States, and for that matter in Europe, even relative to the other subsidized commodities, and I have some facts I want to share with you on that score. Secondly, and equally important, the United States has a big market share and has a major influence on world markets. So not only is it heavily subsidized, it's also a big commodity in world markets. That is, U.S. production's a big part of the world. And least developed country farmers are significant exporters of cotton, and they have suffered. So that this confluence of these three separate facts make cotton special, and I think that explains why it's gotten the kind of attention it has, both in terms of the negotiations and in terms of litigation. Let's have some clarifications about where we stand on cotton. First of all, subsidies isn't all there is in the world cotton market. This is agriculture. There's weather. Weather's more important than anything else in terms of what happens to crops from year to year. That is, the variability from year to year in cotton production and prices relates to the weather. There are long-term trends in cotton production. There's technical change. There's long-term trends in cotton use. There's movements around the world that happen along with the subsidies. But underlying all that, the subsidies keep U.S. production high and prices lower than it otherwise would be. And that's especially true in years when low prices were already expected. And that's the nature of the way the U.S. runs its programs, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I think it's fair to say that every study that's ever looked at this finds that U.S. cotton subsidies drive down world prices. Some studies find, from my point of view, very, very high effects. That is, they find larger effects than I would think is plausible. Others find implausibly low subsidy impacts. And I think it is important. And it's an academic debate, and there is an academic debate about this. But, of course, it's more than academic because it affects the negotiations and it certainly affects the litigation. That is, it's a practical academic debate, if you will. And so it helps to understand what drives some of these things. I think the bottom line with respect to the analysis that academics and others have been involved in there is, at least from my point of view, the most plausible and certainly the modal, the most common estimates are the ones that still say there are substantial subsidy effects on world prices. So let's talk a little more specifically about the U.S. farm subsidy programs. There are two things to say about them. One, they're costly, and the second is they're inordinately complex. This is a semester-long course. What do we got? 7 minutes left. $2 to $4 billion. It varies from year to year. We've heard about marketing loans. That's payments on all production. There's direct payments that are based on historically updated production. There's some planting restrictions tying to those. There's some countercyclical payments that are tied both to price. They're paid on a historical base that's been updated, and there's planting restrictions associated with these. There's crop insurance subsidies. There's export credit guarantees as well. Step 2 is off the table, and it's off the list. I want to focus on the first 3, which are the so-called farm bill subsidies. The other 2 aren't really, the bottom 2 on that list aren't really normally a part of the farm bill. So there's a little picture that some folks at Texas A&M had put together. So cotton farmers in the United States get revenue from 4 sources. There's the market, like everybody else in the world would get. There's the loan program, that's called LDP there, loan deficiency payment. That's paid in all of production. There's a fixed payment that is tied to production in various ways, but it's not based on current production. And there's the so-called counter-cyclical payment. You stack all that up, and that's what a cotton farmer gets. So, and the point from people around the world is that a substantial amount of this revenue isn't coming from the market, it's coming from the government. And it comes in various complicated ways. What's the budget for subsidies in the United States? Here's a slide that I think is very informative about a U.S. issue, and it's a big part of the farm bill that the cotton debate in the U.S. is wrapped up into. Cotton gets about 12% of the subsidies in the United States, about 3% of production value. You go down to the bottom there, the other commodities, these are fruits and vegetables and hay and you name it, most of the meat products, 60% of the share of production value, about 4% of the subsidies. So there really is a focus on a handful of commodities, and cotton is one of that handful. It's not the only one. What determines the effects of cotton subsidies on world prices? One is the subsidy share of revenue. There's some facts we want to know about that. The second is the degree of subsidy linkage. Not all of these programs that the U.S. Subsidizes cotton with are tied directly to production. Second is the supply response in the United States to a fall in this expected per acre revenue. Remember, farmers in the United States get it from the market. They also get it from the subsidy. How responsive are they? If farmers in the United States are going to cut back production when subsidies are lowered, as most of us think they would, and they surely would to some degree, if they cut back a lot, that makes more market for everybody else in the world. It'll have bigger world prices. I think the Cotton Council is right. Many U.S. cotton growers need these subsidies to stay in the cotton business. That's why, in fact, the cotton interests in the United States are so adamant that they want to keep the subsidies. It's not a secret. And this is go through congressional testimony from cotton industry folks, and they say we have to have these subsidies, otherwise we couldn't be in the cotton business. I think for a number of growers, they're right about that. The U.S. share in the world market is important. So is supply response and price transmission into other countries. That's a technical point, but it matters for how big a price effects you get around the world. And I'll get into that in a little while. And so is demand response to price. Cotton is limited. That demand response is limited because for many uses, cotton is a unique unique input. Consumers want their cotton shirts, they want their Levi's made out of cotton. There are all kinds of complex arguments about how decoupled U.S. programs are. I'm not going to go into those there. They are central to the argument, both in the cotton dispute, but also in the cotton negotiations about how much do these various kinds of U.S. programs do. The point, I think, the fair point to make is that the WTO panel and in the negotiations, people have recognized that programs that the U.S. has said they're decoupled are not quite fully decoupled. How decoupled they are, how much they affect production, there's legitimate debate there. Not as much as a direct production subsidy like a marketing loan, but certainly more than zero. And that's something that people argue about it, and legitimately so. Now let's look at some facts. Here's the ratio of subsidy to value production the last couple of years. And it varies from year to year. For cotton, it's been between 70 and 95% of the value production has come from subsidies. That is, value of market. This is the value of production in the market is equal. Some years it exceeds. These 2 years it doesn't quite exceed. Subsidies don't quite exceed market value. And notice for cotton it's higher than for the other commodities. Some years it's higher. For cotton it's always among the very highest. What about where does that subsidy come from? And here I want to make the point that most of the cotton subsidy comes from the countercyclical payments and the loan programs. And those are the ones with the biggest production incentive. They're the most distorting program, and that's where the cotton industry is getting the biggest part of the subsidies. World market shares I've mentioned. Cotton is a major part of the world market, certainly on exports and also on production. These are the key factors that go into determining the effect on world prices. You put those into a simulation model like a number of people are done. The work that I've done suggests that U.S. production would be 20% lower or more. U.S. exports would fall by even more than that. That is, some of the cotton land that's now in production in the United States simply could not be in production of cotton. It would shift to something else if it didn't have these cotton subsidies. World prices would be higher by about 10% if the cotton subsidies weren't in place. They'd still vary from year to year. They'd go up and down with weather and with other things, but they'd be higher than they would otherwise would be. And that would encourage some more production and some additional exports from least developed countries, including in Africa. So let's go to Geneva for a second. Geneva, WTO influences U.S. policy, and U.S. policy influences the WTO. It goes in both directions. And it's important to think about this cotton dispute in the context of the broader Geneva process. I would argue that the litigation is important, and it's interesting how little actual litigation it takes to get lots of attention. There's one or two if you count the sugar case, and at least in the case of cotton, it hadn't even yet been implemented. But influential players in the United States, including the chairs of the major committees in Congress, the Secretary of Agriculture, they all rank the WTO disputes as one of the major drivers for the U.S. Farm Bill. That is, what if U.S. farm programs change in the Farm Bill, what will be behind those changes? And people are pointing to the cotton dispute as a central part of that. Not strictly for cotton, but because of the generalization that other commodities are also vulnerable, as we heard, for the same kinds of issues. That is, I think, and we've heard this from influential members who will be writing the Farm Bill, and from the representative of the President who will be signing it, that they want U.S. policies to comply with WTO obligations. And I believe that's a commitment that political leaders in the United States have made. I think that the litigation over cotton also has importance in the WTO, and one of the most important of those, and I think this is where it comes to implementation by the United States, is that the credibility of the WTO in small and developing countries increased significantly with successful cases brought by a developing country against important, rich agricultural producers. That's both the cotton case and the sugar case. So that small and very poor countries saw the WTO as a place that would respond to their demands. It would respond to things that they wanted to happen. And legal arguments that they could make. That is, the legal process could also work for them. It's also important, therefore, that implementation proceeds. And that's something, no matter whether you think the case was a good case, a bad case, there are decisions against the United States that I may disagree with, but I think it's nonetheless crucial for the United States to implement fully in those cases because of the credibility of the institution, to be able to bring the rest of the world along and say, yeah, we're going to play by the same rules. Now, obviously, the U.S. exercises its legal rights. We know that countries do that. But at the end of the day, being forthcoming about implementation is very important for the success of the international process. Now, let's talk about the initiative itself. It seems to me that the initiative and the negotiations are complements. They go together. Some things that were demands of the initiative may well be achieved or largely achieved by the cotton dispute that Brazil initiated. At the same time, to encourage full implementation and to keep the round going, the initiative is crucially important. We haven't talked about the compensation part this morning. I think that's more this afternoon. But of course, that's in addition. That is, compensation for the past subsidies is something that is unique to the initiative. That's not a part of any that's not a part of any dispute issue. So what are the bottom lines in terms of removing cotton subsidies? Our estimates that the average gain from elimination from U.S. subsidies would be in the range of 5 cents a pound. That's a round figure. That's total revenue if you think of 1.5 billion pounds or so produced in the C4 countries. That's somewhere between $75 and $100 million of additional revenue in the C4 countries alone. There are additional gains throughout the system. There are multipliers on this. And I feel very strongly, and we'll talk about that this afternoon, that there are also dynamic economic stimulus to go with this. This is a huge benefit. In terms of the U.S. budget, this isn't a big number. I mean, we're in Washington, D.C. People throw around billions all the time. But in the context of the economies and the growers we're talking about, this is a huge benefit to some very poor people. One of the challenges, and again, I hope we talk about this a lot this afternoon, is to ensure that those benefits get to the cotton growers. And that's something that is an equal challenge to the international trade issue. So thank you very much. There is detailed analysis. I've prepared a background paper that should be available from the IPC at some stage. If anybody would like to contact me directly, there's a website, there's an email address. Thank you very much. Thanks for giving me a minute or two.
Mm-hmm. Okay, please go ahead. Okay, thanks very much, Dan. Okay. Bye, Mark. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Mark Lang. Dr. Lang is President and CEO of the National Cotton Council of the United States. He came to the National Cotton Council in 1990 as Director of its Economic and Information Services before he was named Vice President for Policy Analysis and Program Coordinator in 2001. He has his PhD in Agricultural Economics from Iowa State University, as well as undergraduate and master's degrees from Indiana State University. He also serves as a member of the National Agricultural Statistics Service Advisory Committee. Earlier in his career, he also was employed in academia, where he was an associate professor of agricultural economics at Louisiana State University. He's also served on editorial boards and various other national professional committees. Mark, we're delighted to have you here as well.
Well, thank you very much. We'll need to see if we can find...
Oh, let me see if I can help you here. Let's minimize... See if we can minimize this one.
There, that's what that is right there. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Bob. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Given the presentations have gone on this morning, thank God no sharp objects were passed out. That might be impaled already. It's interesting to me that every time someone discusses Doha negotiations and the Doha round, there's very precise language that comes out of the 2004 framework, and there's very precise language that comes out of the Hong Kong text. And then that precision and the importance of that meaning gets lost when it's used by the media and some other interests. For example, the flyer about today's program talks about a sectoral negotiation on cotton and identifies a special subcommittee for negotiation when I believe that special subcommittee's role is monitoring. I think it's very important that those of us that are involved in all of the aspects of these negotiations not bring unexpected or raise anticipations or expectations about what might be possible, because that language that's in those agreements and in those stated texts is very important in the political process, as Crawford Falconer noted. It's also interesting to me that there's this massive presumption that because the United States publishes a great deal of data and has quite open establishment of what it does in its subsidies and programs, that there's automatically a presumption of guilt, and it's taken as a matter of faith that the U.S. farmers are out there doing all sorts of damage to the rest of the world. I think, in fact, the openness of the U.S. and what it does brings a laxity to the rest of the world that are concerned about things to jump to presumption, oh, that's all the information we need. I think that's an extraordinary mistake. This is a slide of cotton production by various regions of the world. It's interesting to me that the yellow bar represents production that largely takes place by smallholders. Probably, and this is unknown, it just has to be an estimate, but probably 70 to 80 million cotton farmers farming somewhere around 40 to 42 million acres in that yellow section of that bar. So that means they're farming an acre and less. They're smallholders. They use agronomic practices that aren't a lot different from the West African farmer who's heavily represented here. Where's the representation for those farmers? And I submit those farmers produce under different domestic situation. They face the same market, but they face a different domestic situation. And in fact, their economic situation is different. And it's not always the case that those farmers right now seem to be facing, I think, what are generally considered to be market prices. It's not always the case. The Indian farmer back just 5 years ago was extraordinarily angry about the policies of his government because it denied him the access to the world market. That's not the case now. Different incentives. I think it's important to look at two types of situations in the market, and I'm going to do that today. One is there's an overall cotton market. And you can see here these are prices for West African cotton as reported by Cotlook Limited in their daily price reports. And there's the A index, which is generally taken to be an average world price for a specific quality of cotton. And then there's what's called a Memphis quote, which is the quote offered for U.S. cotton in the Northern Europe market of this A-type quality. And you can see there that there's tremendous range over time in cotton prices. They aren't always depressed, and they aren't always high. Importantly, though, we've only seen two periods where cotton prices, and there were short periods where cotton prices were above 70 cents in the 10 years shown here. If I went back, and I should have produced the slide, if you go back and you look prior to this period, you would find that the average price of cotton in the world was probably higher. It spent more time above 60 cents than you see here, where it's spending a lot of time in the 50 and 60 cent range. We're going to come back and talk about some of those things. In the overall market, what was going on in the last 6 years has just been incredible. I don't think there is another period of time that has seen what has taken place in the China and Indian subcontinent. Between their industrial policies and their agricultural policies and tax incentives, we've watched those group of countries, those same yellow bars that I had up there in production, increase their use of cotton in their textile mills from about 45 million bales a year to almost 80 million bales a year in 6 years. Almost the lion's share of that took place in China. But it's extraordinary. Those three countries now account for 66% of all the cotton spun every year, and it's growing. That won't diminish. Next year it'll probably be 67 or 68. They have extraordinary impact when those textile products go back out into the market. what happens to the value of the input cotton in the world market when the major suppliers of textile and apparel products get into a cutthroat competition for markets in the U.S. and the EU? Have any of you noticed what's happened to apparel prices over the last 15 years in the United States? They continue to decline. They continue to decline. Do you think there was some new technology that created that decline? The input price goes under tremendous pressure when the price of the output begins to continually fall. The other side of this is cotton's not an isolated commodity. It's part of an industrial system. It competes against polyester. China today, by itself, produces more polyester. It produces more polyester than the entire world did in 1990. China today accounts for over 50% of all the world's production of polyester, and Asia accounts for even a greater share. This is an extraordinary chart. Those red bars represent what China has done in polyester production. That's a competing fiber for cotton. And the subsidies provided to the polyester producers and across most of Asia are extraordinary. Now put in cotton production over top of that. Prior to about 2000, cotton was the dominant fiber in the world. Held a market share, depending upon whether you exclude or include carpeting. That always gets messy because very little carpeting is cotton. But in the textile realm, cotton held a market share that was around 50%. And that includes not just against polyester, but all the other man-mades. You know, there's nylon and rayon and acrylics and so forth. Cotton share today in the world's about 35%, maybe fall, maybe lower than that, maybe 32%. You know, if cotton shares like that and the world price of cotton is already low, for those of us who would like to see world prices of cotton go up, we better be careful what we're asking for, because we may just price cotton right out of some markets that it's in right now. And I mean, my producers would like to see cotton prices higher. In China, the extraordinary situation is the red line. That's mill use. China more than doubled its use of cotton in its textile mills between 2000 and 2006. You all believe that was from just unfettered private investment, I'm sure. There weren't any subsidies involved in any of this. You think that when China has almost 50% of the world's textile market and puts that product on the shelf, it has no impact on the input market, cotton? It's having an impact all around the world. If I put this up for Europe, the only difference between the U.S. and Europe would be that the height of the bars stays fairly flat in Europe. Europe's consumption of cotton really hasn't increased much over this period, but this is the U.S. purchase of cotton in the retail market and shirts and towels and so forth. The red bar is what we import. That's what we import. And it used to be that a lot of that red bar actually was imports that were Western Hemisphere imports circulating back from NAFTA and CAFTA and so forth. That's declining. And more of that red bar is Asia. The same yellow bar that I talked about, that same China and Indian subcontinent. The U.S. built an extraordinary market. The U.S. cotton producer, through the efforts of Cotton Incorporated and a cotton promotion program, built an extraordinary market in the United States, the largest retail market for cotton in the world. In fact, in the period I'm showing here, the only market that really grew in that period, till very recently. We're finally seeing some growth now in China and India and subcontinent and actual purchases of cotton by the consumer. But over most of the 90s and early 2000s, The only place where cotton consumption at the retail level was growing was here in the United States. Let's go back and talk about prices again. One of the things I want you to note here is that the U.S. price, what I call Memphis, that's a term from the marketplace. It's complicated, as Dan Sumner said. It's a semester course to talk about the cotton market and the programs that are involved. But the Memphis territory quote in the Northern Europe market shows here that the U.S. quote most of the time is one of the highest priced cottons out there. And unfortunately, the African quote is often one of the lowest quotes out there. So there's prices in general as they move around, and then there's a rather substantial difference in prices that exist on any given day for cottons from various parts of the world. Well, why does that happen? Well, in part, it happens because of the other characteristics that are associated with it, timeliness of delivery and so forth. Unfortunately, for West Africa, in recent years, there's been a serious problem with contamination. Now, this is a report done by the International Textile Manufacturers Federation, but there's similar reports that come out of the Bremen Cotton Institute and the Cotton Exchange Annual Report that indicate one of the problems for West Africa is a much higher level of contamination than is found in other growths of cotton. The International Textile Manufacturers survey textile mills about those. They look at a variety of different sources. The primary problem, according to the mills that are buying these cottons for West Africa, they talk about feathers, animal and human hair, and dust. Simply non-lit matter in the bale that diminishes the value of buying the bale at the outset, which pushes the African cottons into one of the cheaper cottons competing in the international market. Now, they're not the only ones. I mean, I shouldn't pick on African cottons. The U.S. cotton has a reputation for a different kind of problem, NEPs. It's an entanglement of the fiber. But it's easier to clean those out in some cases than it is some other forms of contamination. It's also the case that Uzbek cotton has a fairly substantial reputation around the world for containing a lot of dust and dirt in it. And it sells generally at a price approximately equal to what West African cotton sells for. I think this tells an extraordinary tale that we all ought to be concerned about. Trends in cotton yield. In West Africa, yields are declining. Would they now present a negative trend? There's something going on in West Africa that isn't going on in most of the rest of the cotton-producing world. I could take the U.S. data out of here, and that line isn't going to change much. So the yield, the rest of the world now has the gap, as you see there, that gap's 400 pounds difference per acre. That's extraordinary. If West Africa could simply cut that gap in half, it'd mean almost $100 an acre more to the producer. Well, why is that happening? I submit it's happening for two reasons. One is the West African producer pays more for his inputs than most of the rest of the producers of the world. We've been to West Africa. We hear routinely that they're paying 35 and 40% more for fertilizer than farmers in other parts of the world. What are they getting for their cotton when they grow it? They're getting a lower share of the world price than most of the rest of the world's farmers. We can do a lot to improve things, but some of the problem is domestic. Now let's talk about programs. We've heard that programs can have an impact on prices. National Cotton Council has never denied that programs have impacts on prices. And we've never denied that the U.S. subsidizes its cotton. We'll take issue with Mr. Falconer. He said he didn't care whether it was 10% or 5% in terms of its price suppression. As chairman of the agricultural negotiations in the WTO, he's probably right for the overall negotiations. Unfortunately, I got a stake in some litigation that's going on. That number is important to U.S. cotton. There are a number of studies out there that indicate that removal of subsidies, and most of these don't look at just U.S. subsidies. They talk about removal of interventions by developed countries. And they talk about removal of interventions that include both trade barriers as well as other domestic support mechanisms. And there's a variety of them, all indicating something in that neighborhood of about 5-6% or perhaps less, as several of these do, talk about 3% or so. When you get into the litigation area, it's not just an academic exercise as to whether that's 3% or 10%. It matters significantly. It matters to the C4 countries as well when you talk about their issues seeking some sort of compensation. Their production's been about a little under 3 million bales a year for those four specific countries. Now, sub-Saharan African production's a good bit higher than that. But you see there, we had a price of about 56 cents a pound average over the period. You get about $734 million for the value of their crop. If it is a 2 or 3% price suppression, then you're talking about considerably less than $300 or $400 million in compensation. Okay, thank you. I do want to note that there are some other things that have happened in the last few years that have adversely impacted the West African farmer. The CFA franc, the devaluation there has an immediate impact. Even if cotton prices hadn't changed, with the devaluation makes them less well off immediately. As I noted, they do get a relatively smaller portion of whatever the world price is in any year compared to most of the growers of the world, and they pay more for their inputs than most other growers. If U.S. production falls, the C4 is not the only place where production can increase. There is a reason that Brazil was interested in U.S. subsidies, because Brazil has built and expanded their cotton sector, and they would be poised to improve their production if prices were to increase for whatever reason. Brazil and India India also, in addition to Brazil, India now, part of the reason that yellow bar that I showed you is growing and those yields are increasing is that India's farmers are aggressively adopting genetically enhanced cottons. One of the few least developed countries beyond China and Brazil. Well, China and Brazil aren't least developed. One of the developing countries beyond China and Brazil who are aggressively pursuing adding that vector to the input portion, and it's resulting in substantial increase in yields. West African assistance. There is a Millennium Challenge Fund. As far as I know, it's not been used by the West African countries. I don't know that anything's been applied for. The National Cotton Council, working with USAID and USDA, has created several initiatives that have been are becoming part of the West African Cotton Improvement Project. We did that focusing on what could be done right at the farm level. As I noted, I believe one of the serious problems that faces the West African is a domestic institutional arrangement. We have tried not to invest ourselves in dealing with that. We believe that's a government to government. We will look at things that can help the farmer themselves in terms of soil fertility, entomology, availability of other inputs. The other thing I would note is Sub-Saharan Africa did not support a fiber-forward arrangement when we talked about rules of origin in the AGOA, and I think that would have been to their benefit rather than having third-party products come in. The U.S. has made the changes in its export credit programs, administrative changes. There are a few legislative changes that will be finished up. There will be no further, at least in the U.S. opinion, export subsidy in the commodity credit area, and we have eliminated the Step 2 program. The National Cotton Council, with a coalition of other agricultural organizations in the United States, has supported the U.S. aggressive proposal from 2005, and I think it's very important, as Mr. Falconer noted, it will take a comprehensive agreement, and a comprehensive agreement along the lines of what the U.S. proposed would require significant reduction in the support mechanisms that concern some of you in this room. The U.S. proposal under the amber box would have required, at minimally, a 10 to 12% reduction in the marketing loan rates for all commodities to meet that new guideline of coming in under $7.64 billion in support in the amber box alone. In the other most trade distorting area, the proposal by the United States would require a reduction in the neighborhood of 7 to 10% in the countercyclical payments in order to fall under the cap. Now inside there, as Mr. Falconer noted, there's quite a bit of dispute about product-specific caps that might exist that could affect these rates even further. But just to get into the overall caps requires this kind of change here. So, my message is, for those of you that are concerned about the impact on world markets from distortions, the U.S. proposal, and not just in cotton, but in agriculture in general, the U.S. proposal that was put forward was aggressive. It would make extraordinarily large changes in current domestic policy or necessitate just a change in policy. You might want to move away from some of these policies if you have to reduce some of these loan rates or target prices sufficiently. So I think it is the case that, as Mr. Falconer, I think, is encouraging, Africa's interest is in seeing the negotiations in Doha move forward, supporting further movement to obtain back to something like what was in that U.S. proposal, I believe, is in their interest. And it's a proposal that's supported by the National Cotton Council and most of the U.S. agricultural community. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, we've had a diversity of perspectives. It's exactly what we intended in putting together this panel. We have about 20 minutes for discussion among the panel members, as well as between you participants and the panel members. But does anybody on the panel want to have a quick response to any of the other speakers on the panel, or shall we open it up for questions from the audience? Anybody want to? Nobody rushes. Okay, who's got the first question out here? Yeah, please. Right down here.
I'm Ian Swanson with Inside U.S. Trade. I'll address the question to Mr. Lang and Dr. Sumner. What accounts for the difference in these studies that showed such dramatic differences in the impact on cotton prices of the elimination of cotton subsidies? Mr. Sumner, is there something that the IMF and the World Bank are considering that you're not considering, or vice versa? And finally, if Mr. Sumner specifically could also ask, if I could also ask how the increase in prices would impact African farmers and also the farmers in Pakistan and China and India that are producing cotton.
Yeah, let me give you one thing. Let me clarify something. The World Bank recently produced some of their research using a different kind of model. That's a World Bank study that had effects on cotton prices somewhere in the range of 10 to 12, 15%. So in that range, that's what the World Bank, the most recent World Bank study, comes up with. The old IMF, and it's a working paper from the IMF by a fellow named Tokarik, that leaves out a number of subsidies altogether, just leaves them off the table. Export credit guarantees, for example, crop insurance, it just doesn't count them, so that they're not contributing to the effect. And then the other thing that study actually produces a wide range and sorts across supply and demand elasticities. That study in particular uses extraordinarily large supply elasticities. That's a technical term. These are technical studies, so I apologize for that. But that says there's going to be a heck of a lot of extra production all over the world, and then prices can't rise very much because the world gets swamped. That's the idea there. Some of the studies also happen to use base periods with inordinately high prices to start with. For example, it's a fact that, and we saw this from Mark's charts, 2003 happened to have very high prices. Well, the U.S. programs, the marketing loans and countercyclicals, didn't kick in a big way in 2003. So if you were to say, gee, for the future, it's all going to be like it was in 2003, then the effect of U.S. programs isn't as big because prices are going to be high anywhere. And I think one of the points I tried to make was that U.S. programs are most distorting. They kick in the most when prices are expected to be low, in a sense, which is, of course, for the poor African farmers or farmers anywhere else, that's the worst time. It's to have somebody else who makes sure their farmers don't have to suffer the low prices because they're covered by the subsidies. They continue to produce, drive prices even lower than they otherwise would have been. So those things account for the differences. There's a series of studies that get effects in the 15, 20, 25, 30% range as well. There's a whole range of them going from 30-some%. And I find the ones that are in the 30% range, that is U.S. subsidies or world subsidies in cotton, drive down the price by 30%. I find that larger than I think is plausible. When I look at the sort of models I use, the parameters that it takes of a model, it's a technical point, don't seem plausible to me. Those are too large. I would make exactly the same judgment about the ones that get it in the 2 and 3% range. At least for the question, whether it's litigation or asking what the negotiations, what the initiative might do, the plausible range, and we could spend hours on this, seems to me be somewhere in the center of where various studies have been. Now, you asked the second question, what does it mean for the Africans? And that I certainly agree, and I think the last point I made was as world prices come up, if the U.S. were to remove its subsidies, either because of litigation or because of domestic policy or because the U.S. proposal is adopted at the WTO in agriculture in general, and as Ambassador Falconer said, we go further for cotton, which is a part of the agreement. If that were to happen, and when that happens, you'll have higher prices, and higher prices would be very good for the African farmers, especially good for them if they actually experience those higher prices. That is, it isn't lost somewhere in the marketing chain. And I will leave that to this afternoon's cotton experts and African cotton experts to deal with that. I won't pretend to be the expert on African cotton in the room.
Mark, you want to add anything to that?
Just that the models can be constructed that make have to, because of their very nature, a lot of assumptions about elasticities, as Dan noted. They have to make a lot of assumptions about the role, the way in which various subsidies inject themselves into the decision-making of the producer. And that's one of the more critical things, because where do you have data that's really open? I go back to my earlier statement, that's revealing. Okay, the most open is the U.S. about how do payments actually get to producers. In fact, you can find out how much a producer got. Not everybody runs their programs like us. So how do they affect the producer's decisions? And you have to make an extraordinary number of assumptions about the way these payments come in and affect or don't affect the decisions. And as each of those little tweaks that you have to, each decision you make will affect the outcome.
Okay, thanks. We had another hand right there, and then I'll go to the back.
Yeah, I'm Bill Christ with the Woodrow Wilson Center. My question is really for Ambassador Benango and for Mr. Neto. And basically, it seems to me that if the Brazilians, for example, came in and made a far-reaching, serious offer in market access on industrial goods, it would give a real boost to the Doha round. And from the Africans' perspective, if China and India and Pakistan were to come forward and make some serious commitments in cotton, where they're going to be the major textile producers in the future, more and more, that would be in their long-run interest. So I guess it's really a twofold question. One, for the Africans, how much have you, where are you in maybe breaking ranks with the LDC bloc to press for concessions by the advanced developing countries? And for Brazil, where are you in considering a more far-reaching market access offer to boost the Doha round?
Okay, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Merci. Merci pour la question. Tout d'abord, on n'a pas, compte tenu du fait qu'on n'a pas du temps, on n'a pas eu à développer les différents supports que notre proposition de l'initiative sectorielle du coton a eu comme écho au sein des membres de l'OMC. D'abord, cette proposition a été supportée par les G90, les G33 et la plupart des pays en voie de développement. Le problème, c'est que moi, je l'ai dit dans mon introduction,
as I said in my introduction,
de C4,
the C4 proposal
is
to help restore a legal world, a fair legal balance in the world trade system. So we have had the same discourse as we had during the negotiations. We said that on both sides, both the Europeans are saying we're working with the Americans are saying we're on the European side. What we're saying is we are actually not defending anybody's position. We're here to defend our economies, our cotton producers, our economies that are failing. So to try to put us on one of the other camps is not really a discussion that's going to be useful. It's not really of interest to us. We have really been very strongly calling for a resumption of the negotiations. We are going to continue thinking about this, and we are working with the different parties to try to advocate for resumption of the negotiations. We are here simply to defend the interests of our economies. And we've often been criticized for this, but when we say in Africa, when two elephants come head-to-head, one of them is always going to suffer. And as we said to the Brazilians and to the Americans, if we can have an influence on the negotiations, we are ready to do so. We've tried to do so already. We're not really trying to play one side off the other. The Brazilians, of course, have also had a lot of influence on international trade, especially with the American influence. But we have been especially favorable towards the route of negotiations, and we think that this is the best route to go. And of course, the Brazilians also went through negotiations, but this was not something that proved useful for them and ended up having to be a much more complicated case. And they ended up having to pursue the legal recourse. And yesterday, in fact, when we had a press conference with the president of Burkina Faso, he said it quite well when he said that we are trying to pursue the channel of negotiation and we're trying to push it to a certain level. But beyond a certain level, we will, of course, be obliged to go the legal route, which, of course, is open to all members of the WTO. To say to the Brazilians or to other countries of the G20 that you should take steps to obtain or to open their markets, have greater market access, I think that this is a debate between the two powers. This is not something that we need to be involved in. We have asked the other sides to continue push for the negotiations, and in the meantime, we are trying to also pursue other routes because our cotton industry is dying. And when the United States and other great powers don't want to talk about it, aren't willing to discuss it, just as Mr. Mark was saying, they have been presenting certain proposals, but for these proposals, these programs, we have a country, if we have a country that has been admitted into these multilateral institutions, but which is not able to take advantage of these programs. So the Millennium Challenge Account is, of course, a very specific program and will be helpful for some countries, but not for all. And there are countries that risk not being able to be included in the implementation of the MCA agreement. So I hope that I have answered your question. And I thank you.
Pedro, you want to add a word to that?
Pedro, vous voulez ajouter quelque chose?
Oui,
ce n'est pas la vision du Brésil en ce qui concerne l'accès au marché qui a provoqué ces problèmes.
It's not the issue.
C'est pas ça la
Really,
question.
not seeing what is happening. If you go back all of the rounds, the developed world formed GATT and formed WTO. If you go back to the Uruguay round, the United States started in Punta del Este with a zero subsidy speech. We ended up with the agreement on agriculture, which we have a case, a litigation case, which the United States do not follow, the Uruguay round agreement. If you look at the rest of the Uruguay round, you have intellectual property, you have services. The developed world have to understand that they not can win everything every time. They have to give a step back, or development will be very difficult. And I think that's the issue of the Doha round. It's called development round. And if you expect for Brazil to pay in non-agricultural market access for what you have to do anyway, I think that's not the issue. I think Brazil has lowered its industrial tariffs, non-agricultural tariffs, significantly, and will continue to lower because it is good for a country. We have established intellectual property laws because it is good for a country. And now it's time for the United States to put order on their foreign policy because it's good for your country. And that's what not seems to be understood here in Washington.
Okay, thanks, Pedro. Ralph Victor next in the back row. Please use the microphone.
Thank you very much. I would like to come back to the point that had just been made. I frankly am a little shocked to hear officials of the WTO as an institution talking about cotton issue being linked to the fate of the Doha round, which most normal people now think is going into deep freeze for at least 2 or 3 years. My point is that when I hear Monsieur Lamy or Mr. Falconer say that very same thing without even mentioning litigation and implementation, I think it does a disservice to the institution. It's not their role to condone the attitude of the United States, which basically say, hey, the heck was that, we're going to roll it over in the negotiation, and to just, ignore their own dispute settlement procedures. They should be pushing for implementation. They should be pushing for an issue to this. They should not condone the fact that one big power, and I know the EU has done it before, so I'm not criticizing anybody there. The point being, we can only get away with it because we are big powers if they're done in the WTO. A small country wouldn't be able to get away. So I think it's not the role for the WTO as an institution, and especially its top representative, to make this kind of public statement, even if it's political reality. I'm sorry.
Okay, Crawford, you want?
Well, I can clarify one thing to begin with. I've never pretended to be a normal person. So, hey, when I took a job in Geneva for a year, the qualifications to be abnormal, okay? And as the chair, I can't even get away with 2 heads. I have to have 154 heads. So, you don't get any more weird than that. Now, let me say two things, okay? You gave a very characteristically, if I might say so, constructive interpretation of my remarks. So I will deconstruct your remarks. Okay, well, Pascal can speak for himself, and frequently does. But what I can say is a couple of things. Yeah, when you're talking about the negotiations, which is what I'm here to talk about, and I think what Pascal was talking about, when you're here to talk about the negotiations, I stand by what I said. It's the reality, okay? Once upon a time I was a normal person, and in the normal world, yeah, it's a different question. Whatever countries can or should do unilaterally is there. And what you want to go to litigation on is an entitlement, and people can pursue it. But one thing I think, and that debate is a debate which you are obviously keen to engage in, and I'm not going to comment on those for obvious reasons, except to say the following. Don't overestimate litigation in the WTO. I mean, don't underestimate it. I value it very highly for various reasons. I think it's terribly important. And one of the reasons that I think it's really important to have a negotiated outcome is that I don't think the dispute settlement system, generally speaking, is completely clinically isolated from the reality of the organisation as a negotiating forum. It was the product, binding dispute settlement, or close to, was the product of the last negotiation. It's a relatively young child. I would never want anything to undermine it, but anybody who was trying to minimise the downside risks of all of this would say it would be a wiser course of action to get a genuinely satisfactory negotiated outcome, A, for the substance, and B, precisely to reinforce the strength of the dispute settlement system thereafter. And, even at a more mundane level, chances are with a successful negotiation that any future litigation is going to be on a more solid basis. Some of my best friends are lawyers, don't get me wrong, okay? But I think it would be a sad day, and probably politically a very undesirable day, if all we have to rely on is litigation. And I think that's something which I think is really important to bear in mind, so that, there are a lot of ambulance chasers around this town and in Geneva. You've got to be a little careful about their siren call sometimes, because it's not always there for the best of interest. But don't get me wrong, that's important, and I know a lot of the discussion you've had today about the precision of the numbers has been because there is pending litigation. My point about that, and I'll leave it on this, is that the reality of what's going on out there as a negotiation point of view is that I think that's not the way you go about it for a negotiating point of view. You get the big picture right, and then you move from there. But you may be right. We may be in the deep freeze for a very long time. But I'll tell you what, the best way to get out of the deep freeze is to throw the door open and let people know what's going on. And I certainly hope there's some degree of heat and light on this issue that will actually allow people to think, hey, this is not an academic exercise that's going on in Geneva. It's a life and death issue for some people. I'm not going to be too dramatic about it. But it really matters because I don't think everything else can just happen automatically as if the round had never been in place. It will have contamination effects if it fails.
Okay, we've got a lot of hands now. I've got two down here. I've got one halfway back, and I'm going to collect 4 or 5 short comments, maximum 2 minutes, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. I'm sorry. Okay, down here we had.
Wait, you have one with the microphone.
He's at least. Back there. Okay, sorry. All right, but. You were 5, but we'll go to number 3 and 4 down here.
I'm Greg Rushford. I published the Rushford Report. A question, a very quick one for either of the ambassadors. Do you find that some of the African countries are worried that farm subsidies would be eliminated because they benefit consumers in urban areas of Africa and benefit the African countries that are net importers of food?
Okay. Next question was down here. Was Ken?
Yes. group, and my question is for Professor Lang and Professor Sumner. Sorry. I'm Ken Cook with the Environmental Working Group, and my question is for Professor Lang and Professor Sumner, and maybe about two, which is, since so much of the issue seems to be around the price-affected subsidy mechanisms, the countercyclical payments, the marketing loans, what are the possibilities for shifting the relative weight of support in the U.S. towards fixed direct payments, even though they have their own problems? But there's less, I think, as Dan said, less controversy about that. What are the possibilities? What would be the implications of that?
Okay, we'll pass the mic right behind you here. This gentleman.
Merci. Je crois que je dois vous remercier très sincèrement à Woodrow Wilson International Center d'avoir organisé ce débat qui se passe en dehors de Genève et qui est un débat académique. En fait, je crois que la situation aujourd'hui des négociations, si on voit là où les négociations se trouvent aujourd'hui,
considering where the negotiations are today, the situation is due to the fact, as my Brazilian friend said, that countries want all of it and all the time. Let's go back to the Uruguay round. Most countries in development only signed almost blindly. So the developed countries took everything on their side, whether about subsidies. Only developed countries can afford subsidies that are forbidden. Subsidies that are a distortion of the international system. In most developing countries, in particular Africa, in the 80s, we had structural adjustment programs from the IMF and World Bank programs. All our little subsidy programs to our farmers were eliminated, dismantled. And this is the situation that is happening while developed countries can afford everything for their farmers. We mentioned the mechanism to solve disputes. This is not for small countries; it's for big countries. In the case of cotton, Brazil only won because it paid millions of dollars while their farmers are already bankrupt, and this was won, and we don't know whether the implementation will happen. Therefore, this is why these academic problems are real problems, and all countries in the world have responsibilities in as far as international trade for the benefit of all of us.
Pass the microphone right behind you, and then we'll take one brief additional comment or question, and then we'll have a quick response.
Merci. Robert Appetit, je suis étudiant béninois.
Robert Appetit from Benin. Intern in a bank. I am here as a world citizen, and I have an economic background. My question is for Mark Lange. Je vais essayer de parler en anglais. Je serai d'accord avec vous à 99%. Merci pour les chiffres que vous avez proposés. C'est vrai que vous avez soumis différents problèmes dans les pays C4. Ce sont des problèmes locaux tels que les prix plus élevés des engrais. Vous avez également évoqué le fait que les agriculteurs chinois n'étaient pas là aujourd'hui. J'aurais bien aimé qu'ils le soient, cela donnait voix au chapitre. Mais la vraie question sera comment est-ce que à quel point ces subventions affectent-elles les pays C4? Ils ont des programmes d'ajustement économique, et comment est-ce que ces agriculteurs locaux sont affectés? Vous pouvez compacter le PIB de ces pays au PIB chinois. La Chine a déjà des problèmes avec l'Union européenne au niveau des subventions. Mais ces centaines de millions de dollars représentent des problèmes colossaux pour ces pays par rapport à leur PIB. Donc ces subventions auraient dû être éliminées il y a longtemps. Il est trop facile aujourd'hui d'accuser la Chine et n'accusez pas les victimes. Les États-Unis auraient dû éliminer ces subventions, ils ne l'ont pas fait. Nous sommes ici pour apporter des solutions constructives et pour trouver de véritables solutions à ce problème. Chaque panéliste peut avoir
to each other, and maximum 1 minute each, and then we have to head for lunch. Pedro?
Oh, 1 minute.
Say one
minute
important
by
thing.
surprise like this. I think it's. I cannot understand how the United States ignores cotton. I mean, it's just has the blame, the position, gets the focal because of cotton and what they do on cotton. We saw the numbers. It's absolutely nothing to do with the market. Has nothing. This is the country where it's supposed to be the leader of this type of economy, market economy. Cotton ignores market economy. And you get the blame for it and do nothing. And then I once thought that the dispute would create the momentum that created in Europe for the sugar case. Europe has changed their sugar regime. They've used the case as an excuse or whatever, but they're over the hill. They had a distortion, they're over the hill. Here, it's ignored. And now, this week, we'll start another panel, an implementation panel. Okay. Will it be ignored again?
Mark?
Well, I would say that the U.S. did not ignore it. The U.S. Position is it has complied. It eliminated a banned export subsidy and eliminated a payment to the exporters and the manufacturers in the form of the Step 2 program and addressing serious prejudice. It's also the case, I believe, that the U.S. proposal on reductions in trade-distorting subsidies provides one of the best mechanisms for addressing issues about subsidies that is available. Support for the U.S. position in the Doha negotiations brings about fundamental change. And I've said before, the National Cotton Council, with a large coalition of agricultural organizations in the United States, supports that U.S. position.
Okay. Crawford?
3 things. 1, like anything in the world, you can make the appeal to make things change, whether from self-interest, whether from the consequences of your actions to do something you wouldn't otherwise want to. That's perfectly legitimate. That's been the case in cotton, and presumably after the round that debate will continue whether the round succeeds or not. Second possibility is litigation. You do litigation, and that's being done and probably will continue. But you do have a third option. And, frankly, I learned from an early age that if you're going to be betting, you ought to have more than one horse running. And I think the Cotton Four understood that very well when they wanted to make this part of the negotiations. Now, if all you're left with is the first 2, fine. You do that. Why is it part of the round? It's nothing to do with it being, altruism, self-interest. It's political calculation. Now, maybe the political calculation is wrong, but in an ugly, unpleasant, unfair world, which doesn't respect rationality, the round combination is, well, hey, we might be able to put together a political deal that may not be just, may not be fair, may not make a hell of a lot of sense, but because of the reality of politics, creates possibilities that wouldn't otherwise be there. Now, you can turn your nose up at it and say, well, shouldn't be like that, people should just do it. Or you can say, well, it probably won't succeed, and you might be right. But I come back to a very simple formulation, which is I think it's still worth trying because it's still worth having some other option that might, even not for the right reasons, perhaps for wrong, mercantilist, crazy reasons, come up with an outcome that is better than otherwise would be the case. And at the very least, you've got nothing to lose. So if you care about the issue, I would say don't turn your nose up at that option and just think that everything else is going to take care of business, because I suspect it won't. So I would use whatever option I had, and I think this is one of them still. One hopes.
Ambassador Bamanga.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have too much to add, but simply I'd like to reassure our American friends by creating the C4. We're not going against American interests, as our Ministry of Trade said. We're not against American interests or against European interests. After the dismantling of different economies through the World Bank and the IMF, we committed to the WTO, thinking that this is an organization that has litigations that can promote a certain equity within the world trade, and this is it within that framework that we are working. Our minister said WTO equals cotton. For Chad, WTO equals cotton. We would not be part of the WTO if not for cotton. There's a legal problem, but also a moral problem. The U.S. have a moral responsibility towards developing countries. By organizing this meeting, I think that the American public can understand what is at stake, and this is why I really want to commend the organizers for what they've done to made the public more aware of what is happening in our countries. Kids cannot get schooling. They do not get medication. This is the situation of our population today. Thank you.
Dan, last word.
Well, I want to respond to a couple of the points that were made, two or three. One, the issue about food importers and subsidies. I think that's an interesting, broad issue, and I want to make clear that's another reason that cotton is unique, and another reason for the cotton initiative being highlighted as it is. The other comment that I want to respond to was the idea of the price-tied subsidies, the marketing loan and the counter-cyclical, being more trade distorting, more distorting on the world markets. It's also more distorting on the U.S. markets, and there are reasons to focus on those for purely domestic reasons. I think there is a chance to shift subsidies away from those most trade-distorting subsidies, not just for cotton, but for other products. I think that shift is likely to be broader than just to direct payments, but it would include shifts towards agricultural support, towards things that enhance productivity here in the United States. And that would be things like research and development, environmental support, other commodities. There are a variety of things that we can do with our agricultural subsidy or agricultural funds in the United States that would enhance the productivity of U.S. agriculture for the long run, that would be good for the world and would do much less to distort the allocation of resources here in the United States. And I was very happy to hear Mark speak so favorably about the U.S. WTO proposal from last October. In fact, I would submit that that proposal is a very good starting point as a Farm Bill position. That is, if the United States, and with a Cotton Council support, it could well happen. If you could imagine cutting the cotton, those of you that follow cotton numbers, imagine cutting the cotton target price to 65 cents and the cotton loan rate in the United States to 45 cents as a part of U.S. action, whether it's meeting something, I don't have any idea whether that would satisfy Brazil, but it would go a long way as a unilateral action to really making people recognize that the U.S. is actually serious about a proposal that it made last August. The U.S. doesn't have to wait for the rest of the world. It can do these things. And I think, in fact, that sort of doing it first, that's a strategy that the European Union has pursued, by the way, quite successfully, both in the Uruguay round and in this round. And I think it's something that the U.S. ought to do now. I think it would be a smart negotiating move. And the U.S.'s idea that, no, we won't do anything until they force us at the last minute has really not been successful. And it would be more successful to do something, to sort of kickstart the round by doing something unilateral. And I think the idea that Mark emphasized, that the U.S. has a proposal on the table, well, let's just do it. That's my point of view.
Okay, thank you. Let's express our appreciation to the panel for a very stimulating session. Okay, who has the instructions for lunch?
Un équipement différent de celui que vous utilisez dans cette salle.
Okay.
Un équipement qui vous attend dans la salle. Merci.
Are you going to be here this afternoon?
Not for long. I mean, I've got to go and see a few people this afternoon.
Oh, I imagine when you're in Washington, there are a few people you have to see.
I have to go get smacked, and then I'll then I have a few other people I got to see. But because I'll have to head off probably. In fact, I may not even. Yeah, I don't know how much. Maybe for about an hour.
Who's the fellow in the back of the room that asked that question?
I think it's
didn't
French.
Bonjour.
I didn't quite hear exactly. I think it was French. Merci. Oh, oui.